Investigators are now focusing heavily on anyone who had legitimate access to Nancy Guthrie's home in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. This includes electricians, HVAC technicians, contractors, landscapers, and delivery personnel. Anyone who entered the property and became familiar with its layout, entry points, and security habits. One detail has drawn particular attention from forensic analysts. The back door was not forced open. It was propped open. There were no broken locks, no damage, no signs of forced entry. Instead, something had been placed to prevent the door from closing, effectively creating a silent re-entry point. This has led to a specific and troubling hypothesis. Someone who had been inside the home during a legitimate service visit may have intentionally left the door accessible, allowing them to return later without needing to break in. The absence of forced entry strongly supports the idea that the suspect either had access or created it in advance. An electrician had been working at the home to replace an electrical panel, a job that required multiple days and work orders. HVAC workers had also performed maintenance. Others had passed through the property over time. Each of these individuals would have seen the home's interior layout, door placements, and daily patterns. According to experienced forensic analysts, this type of access-based crime is not uncommon. There have been multiple cases where individuals with legitimate reasons to enter a home later used that familiarity to commit serious crimes. The investigation has now expanded beyond the home itself. Authorities are reviewing work orders, timelines, and personnel records, not just for Nancy's house but for nearby properties as well. Anyone working in the neighborhood could have observed routines, entry points, and environmental factors like vegetation that might allow movement without being seen. DNA collection is a key part of this process. Investigators can obtain a buccal swab, quick and non-invasive, from each worker and compare it directly to the unidentified DNA recovered from Nancy's bedroom. A match would immediately identify a suspect. Attention is also being paid to physical evidence that may have been overlooked. The object used to prop the back door, the door handle, and the door frame itself could all contain fingerprints, DNA, or trace material. Questions have been raised about whether these areas were properly processed during the initial crime scene investigation. Other potential evidence includes surfaces like rugs or doormats. Blood can seep into fabric and become invisible to the naked eye, but still detectable through specialized forensic techniques. If such materials were not collected or tested, critical evidence may still be unaccounted for. Blood evidence found at the front of the house suggests a violent encounter. The patterns indicate that Nancy was likely attacked near the entrance, fell forward, and expelled blood consistent with lung injury before being carried away. Meanwhile, investigators are searching for a vehicle believed to be connected to the crime, a gray or silver SUV or pickup truck. A vehicle is considered a secondary crime scene. If Nancy was injured during transport, her blood would likely be inside. Additionally, the suspect would have left behind DNA on surfaces like the steering wheel, door handles, and controls. Another emerging lead involves consumer product tracing. Items seen in surveillance footage, including a backpack and possibly footwear, appear to belong to the Ozark Trail brand, sold exclusively at Walmart. If confirmed, purchase data could help narrow down potential suspects through transaction records. Forensic experts are also analyzing movement patterns captured on video. The way a person walks, their gait, foot strike, and wear patterns on shoes can serve as a unique identifier, similar to a fingerprint. Despite these developments, challenges remain. The crime scene was released relatively quickly, and some evidence may not have been collected at the time. Investigators are now working to reconstruct what might have been missed. Nancy Guthrie remains missing. The investigation continues to evolve as new evidence is examined and old assumptions are revisited. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. Investigators have now shifted from early-stage evidence collection into a full reconstruction phase where every known movement, access point, and interaction tied to Nancy Guthrie's home is being mapped minute by minute. The goal is no longer just identifying who had access, but determining who had opportunity, who had knowledge of the property's vulnerabilities, and who fits the narrow overlap between physical access and digital presence in the critical window before her disappearance. The timeline remains the backbone of the case. Surveillance footage from the front door camera has been repeatedly enhanced and reanalyzed. Analysts are extracting frame-by-frame motion data to identify not only individuals, but behavioral patterns, how long someone stayed, whether they appeared to be observing surroundings, and whether any repeated visits occurred under the guise of legitimate work. What stands out is not just who entered the property, but how often the property was entered by different service workers in a relatively short span of time. Electricians returning for follow-up panel work, HVAC technicians revisiting system adjustments, occasional maintenance calls that, while normal on the surface, collectively created repeated exposure to the home's interior layout. Each entry is now being treated as a potential reconnaissance event rather than routine maintenance. Investigators are also building a layered digital profile of everyone associated with those visits. Work orders are being pulled from contractor companies, cross-referenced with employee schedules, GPS logs from service vehicles where available, and phone location data when warrants allow. The objective is to determine whether any individual shows unexplained proximity to the home outside of scheduled appointments. At the same time, forensic teams are reevaluating the physical layout of the house itself, not as it appeared after the incident, but as it functioned in the days leading up to it. Entry points, lighting conditions, vegetation around exterior pathways, and visibility from neighboring properties are all being digitally reconstructed. The back door remains one of the most critical focal points. Its condition, propped rather than forced, suggests deliberate preparation. Investigators are now testing multiple scenarios to understand how that could have occurred without drawing attention. One possibility is that the door was intentionally left in a compromised state during an earlier visit, allowing later re-entry without resistance. This shifts the investigative question from "how did someone get in" to "when did access first become possible?" Inside the home, forensic specialists are re-examining trace evidence that may have been previously overlooked or considered low priority during the initial sweep. Carpet fibers near entry points are being retested for biological material. Specialized lighting techniques are being used to detect latent blood patterns that may not be visible under normal conditions. Even microscopic residue in door hinges, latch plates, and flooring seams is being reanalyzed. These are areas where contact is unavoidable during entry and exit, and where DNA transfer is most likely to occur even in brief interactions. A significant focus is also being placed on transfer evidence, materials unintentionally carried away from the scene. Dirt, fibers, plant matter, and microscopic debris can all create traceable links between a suspect and the environment of the home. Investigators are comparing samples from the residence to environmental data collected from worker uniforms, tools, and vehicles. In parallel, attention has returned to the possibility of surveillance gaps. While the front door camera provided critical footage, investigators are now assessing whether blind spots existed around the rear of the property. Satellite imagery is being requested for specific time windows, with analysts attempting to determine whether any unusual movement patterns or vehicle stops can be detected from overhead data. Although satellite resolution limits detail, changes in vehicle positioning, shadow anomalies, and ground disturbance patterns can still provide supporting evidence when combined with ground-level intelligence. The vehicle search remains unresolved but active. The gray or silver SUV or pickup truck described in multiple investigative leads continues to be a priority target. Analysts are now examining traffic camera networks, toll records where applicable, and fuel station surveillance footage along likely exit routes from the neighborhood. Investigators are also applying behavioral mapping techniques, attempting to reconstruct the most logical escape paths based on road layout, traffic density, and time of day. This includes secondary roads that avoid main surveillance corridors. Meanwhile, forensic analysts are continuing to evaluate the significance of brand-linked evidence recovered from surveillance imagery. If the backpack and footwear are confirmed to be from the same manufacturer line, investigators may be able to narrow down purchase data to specific retail locations and transaction windows. That data could then be cross-referenced with employee access logs and service calls in the same geographic area. However, investigators are cautious. Consumer product linkage alone is not sufficient evidence of identity. It is being treated as a supporting layer rather than a primary lead. Inside law enforcement circles, there is also growing focus on behavioral consistency. Analysts are studying whether the suspect demonstrated familiarity with the home beyond what a one-time visitor would typically retain. This includes knowledge of door alignment, entry timing, and internal movement routes that would minimize visibility from outside windows. Such familiarity, if confirmed, would strengthen the theory of repeated prior access. At the same time, investigators are carefully considering alternative explanations. One possibility is that the perpetrator was not a service worker themselves, but someone who accompanied or followed a legitimate worker into the area. In such a scenario, access could have been observed, replicated, or exploited without direct employment authorization. This expands the suspect pool significantly, which is why investigators are now reviewing neighborhood-level activity logs. Doorbell cameras from adjacent homes are being collected where available, and residential security systems are being scanned for unusual movement patterns around the same time frame. Digital forensics teams are also examining cellular tower data to identify devices that may have repeatedly appeared near the property during service visits and again during the critical incident window. Repeated presence in a small geographic area can indicate surveillance behavior, especially if it aligns with known service schedules. Despite the extensive analysis, investigators face a persistent challenge: the absence of a confirmed suspect identity. While multiple theories are being explored, no single individual has yet been definitively tied to both the physical evidence and the behavioral timeline. This creates a parallel investigative pressure, narrowing suspects without prematurely excluding possibilities. From a forensic standpoint, the most valuable evidence remains biological. DNA recovered from the bedroom and entry points continues to be the strongest potential identifier. If matched, it would immediately transform the case from a broad investigative field into a targeted prosecution. For that reason, all service personnel, contractors, and individuals with verified access are being prioritized for voluntary or warrant-based DNA sampling. The process is systematic and methodical, designed to eliminate ambiguity and reduce the suspect pool through direct exclusion rather than inference. Legal teams are also preparing for potential defense arguments. One anticipated line of defense is contamination or secondary transfer, particularly given the number of individuals who entered the home in a short time frame. Prosecutors will need to demonstrate not only presence but meaningful context linking any DNA to the crime event itself. Chain of custody documentation, scene preservation records, and forensic protocol adherence are therefore under secondary review to ensure evidentiary integrity can withstand courtroom scrutiny. At a broader level, the case is also prompting internal reviews of crime scene processing standards. Questions are being raised about whether all trace evidence was collected at the appropriate stage, and whether certain materials should have been prioritized earlier in the investigation. These procedural concerns do not change the facts of the case, but they may influence how strongly certain evidence can be presented later in court. Meanwhile, Nancy Guthrie remains missing, and that reality continues to drive urgency across every investigative branch. Search efforts, while more targeted now than in the initial phase, are still active in areas identified through behavioral and geographic modeling. Every new piece of data, whether from digital logs, forensic reanalysis, or witness follow-ups, is being fed into a centralized reconstruction model. That model continuously updates potential scenarios, weighting likelihoods based on consistency with known physical and digital evidence. Despite the complexity of the investigation, one consistent pattern has emerged. The case is defined not by a single dramatic failure point, but by multiple small access opportunities that collectively created vulnerability. The back door being propped open, repeated service visits, environmental familiarity, gaps in observation coverage. Each factor alone may be explainable. Together, they form a framework investigators believe is critical to understanding what happened. Still, the central questions remain unresolved. Who had both access and intent? Who was present in the critical window? And who, despite leaving behind traces of their presence, has not yet been identified? Until those answers are confirmed through definitive forensic linkage, the investigation remains active, open, and evolving, and every new detail continues to reshape what investigators thought they understood from the beginning. As the investigation expands, a second wave of analysis is being directed at something that initially seemed routine: the pattern of human behavior around the home in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Investigators are no longer only asking who entered the property, but what normal looked like for that household, and how easily that normal could have been studied, anticipated, and eventually exploited. This includes revisiting seemingly minor details: delivery timing, contractor arrival patterns, neighborhood traffic flow, and even the rhythm of daily activity visible from the street. Analysts are building what they refer to as a behavioral baseline, a reconstruction of ordinary life before anything went wrong. The goal is to identify deviations that may have gone unnoticed at the time but now stand out as potential indicators of pre-planning. One of the strongest emerging theories is that the offender did not act spontaneously, but instead relied on observation over time. This does not necessarily require long-term stalking in the traditional sense. In many cases, investigators note, opportunity-based offenders gather enough information simply by repeatedly entering a space under legitimate cover. A few visits can be enough to understand entry points, security habits, and moments of vulnerability. That is why the repeated presence of service personnel remains central to the investigation. Each visit created a brief window of familiarity. Each return allowed for updated mental mapping of the property. Over time, these fragments of knowledge can accumulate into a complete understanding of how to move through a space without resistance. Investigators are now examining whether any of those visits overlapped with subtle changes in the home's security behavior. For example, whether doors were consistently locked during certain hours, whether lights followed predictable patterns, or whether any entry points were occasionally left unsecured due to habit or convenience. At the same time, forensic psychologists are contributing behavioral profiling to narrow suspect characteristics. Based on the current evidence pattern, they are considering whether the offender demonstrated traits consistent with opportunistic planning rather than impulsive violence. This includes patience, environmental awareness, and the ability to blend into routine activity without raising suspicion. These traits are often associated with individuals who are comfortable in service environments, people accustomed to entering unfamiliar homes, interacting briefly with occupants, and leaving without leaving a lasting impression. Importantly, investigators stress that this does not define guilt. It only helps refine the behavioral model. Meanwhile, the physical evidence continues to be reprocessed in specialized laboratories. Items recovered from entry points are being subjected to advanced DNA extraction techniques capable of isolating even highly degraded biological material. Touch DNA, once considered unreliable in older cases, is now being reevaluated with newer amplification technologies that can reconstruct profiles from microscopic traces. Even surfaces previously thought to be sterile are being reconsidered. Door edges, hinge cavities, and textured materials like painted wood and rough metal can retain biological material far longer than smooth surfaces. In environments with repeated contact, these microtraces can layer over time, creating a composite biological record of everyone who interacted with them. Investigators are particularly focused on separation events, moments where contact between individuals and objects likely occurred under tension or movement. These include door manipulation, object placement, and rapid exit scenarios. Such moments increase the probability of skin cells, sweat residue, or trace fibers transferring onto surfaces. In parallel, digital forensic teams are refining their reconstruction of movement outside the home. Cellular data continues to be mapped against known service appointments, but investigators are now layering additional data sets, including anonymized device clustering, which can reveal repeated proximity patterns even when identity is not immediately known. This allows analysts to detect whether the same unknown device appeared near the property multiple times under different contextual conditions, such as during scheduled maintenance visits and again outside of those windows. A repeated pattern of proximity without explanation can be a strong indicator of surveillance behavior. Vehicle analysis is also being expanded. Beyond identifying a specific gray or silver SUV or pickup truck, investigators are now reconstructing traffic flow models based on exit timing. This involves calculating how long it would take to leave the neighborhood using various routes under different traffic conditions, then comparing that against any recorded vehicle movement in surrounding camera networks. Even partial sightings, such as headlights, reflections, or silhouette outlines, are being digitally enhanced to extract potential identifying features. Tire tread impressions from nearby roads are also being compared against known vehicle types when physical traces are available. Despite these efforts, investigators acknowledge that the absence of a clear suspect identity remains the most significant obstacle. While circumstantial evidence is accumulating across multiple categories, access, timing, environmental familiarity, and trace biological material, none of it has yet converged into a single confirmed individual. This has led to a dual-track strategy. One track focuses on narrowing suspects through exclusion, while the other continues expanding the evidence base to increase the probability of a direct match. It is a balance between elimination and discovery. On the forensic side, laboratories are now conducting cross-comparisons between all collected DNA profiles from service workers and the unknown sample recovered from the residents. Even partial matches or familial indicators are being analyzed to determine whether there are genetic connections that could suggest indirect identification pathways. At the same time, investigators are revisiting the possibility of secondary transfer, where DNA is unintentionally carried into a location via objects, clothing, or contact chains. This is particularly important in environments with multiple workers, where cross-contamination between tools or surfaces can occur without direct interaction between individuals and the primary scene. To address this, chain of custody protocols are being reviewed in detail. Every item collected from the scene is being traced from point of recovery through every stage of handling, transport, and testing. The goal is to ensure that any future courtroom presentation of evidence can withstand scrutiny regarding contamination or procedural error. As the investigation deepens, attention has also turned to psychological reconstruction of the offender's actions during and after the incident. Behavioral analysts are studying likely decision-making patterns, including whether the offender acted with pre-planned intent to avoid detection, or whether adjustments were made dynamically during the event. One key question is whether the offender demonstrated familiarity with concealment strategies, such as avoiding visible pathways, minimizing noise, and reducing trace deposition during movement. These behaviors, if confirmed, would suggest prior experience or deliberate preparation. There is also ongoing analysis of post-event behavior. Investigators are considering whether the offender remained in the area after the disappearance or immediately left the region. Both scenarios carry different investigative implications. Remaining nearby increases risk of exposure but may indicate confidence or familiarity with local surveillance limitations. Leaving quickly suggests awareness of investigative response timing. Search efforts, although now more targeted, continue to focus on areas identified through combined environmental and behavioral modeling. These include low visibility zones, transitional landscapes between residential and rural areas, and locations where vehicle access is possible without sustained observation. Ground teams are using historical data to prioritize search grids, focusing on terrain features that align with known disposal patterns in similar cases. Water sources, abandoned structures, and roadside embankments remain key points of interest. Despite the complexity of the case, investigators emphasize that the structure of the investigation is becoming more refined with each passing stage. Early uncertainty has given way to a more defined framework of hypotheses, each being tested against physical, digital, and behavioral evidence. Importantly, every new layer of analysis reduces the number of plausible scenarios. While no single conclusion has been reached, the investigative field is narrowing. At the center of it all remains a simple but critical fact: an unexplained disappearance preceded by signs of controlled access, environmental familiarity, and biological evidence that does not belong to the known occupants of the home. The convergence of these elements is what continues to drive the investigation forward. As new forensic techniques are applied and older evidence is re-examined under improved technology, investigators remain focused on a single objective: translating fragmented traces into a coherent sequence of events that can be legally and scientifically verified. And while many questions remain unanswered, the structure of the case is no longer undefined. It is increasingly organized around patterns, probabilities, and physical realities that continue to point toward a narrowing set of explanations. The work now is not only to discover what happened, but to prove it in a way that can withstand scrutiny, challenge, and time. And until that point is reached, the investigation continues, layer by layer, trace by trace, and lead by lead, toward resolution.